After the communists gained control of Yugoslavia, more than 250,000 prisoners of war and civilians were murdered in the fall of 1944 to the start of 1946. More than 15,000 Slovenes were murdered in Slovenia, as well as tens of thousands of people of independent state of Croatia, more than 10,000 Serbs and Montenegrins, several thousand German prisoners of war and others. The Commission on Concealed Mass Graves in Slovenia is investigating more than 800 concealed killings and burial sites primarily from May and June 1945. Just like the American and the Spanish, the Slovene Civil War also resulted in 2% of the population being murdered. Communists killed around 25,000 and anti-communists around 5,000. After the end of Second World War, in the worst fratricidal crime in Slovene history, the communist authorities murdered more than 15,000 Slovene prisoners of war and civilians, 1% of the population of Slovenia. According to the agreement between the Yugoslav authorities and the British Army in Koroška, more than 12,000 Croats were returned to Yugoslavia from 18th to 23rd May 1945. On 24th and 25th May, around 5,000 Serbs and 400 Montenegrins, and from 27th to 30th of May, more than 11,000 Slovene prisoners of war and 600 civilians. The British kept reassuring that they would be taken to camps in Italy. The Diocesian High School in Šentvid Ljubljana was the most destructive concentration camp for Slovenes in all three totalitarian regimes. More than 5,000 Slovene prisoners of war and few civilians were brought to the concentration camp in the institute in Šentvid via Jesenice. The killing of those returned from Koroška began immediately after crossing the border at Hrušica and continued in Kranj, Škofja Loka, Bodovelska, in Lorenška Grapa, Rivens. Home Guards, brother Anton and Franz Mehle, turned themselves into the authorities in May 1945. They smuggled some letters from the camp in Šentvid. Even before the arrival of more than 20,000 people brought from Vrtinje, there were about 20,000 inmates in Šentvid. The brothers wrote about hunger. If we ate at home the way we ate here, 1 year would be enough for 15 years. They were aware that their fate was being decided also by the new local authorities. We were questioned a bit superficially, only once more. As the local committee shall decree, so shall it be. Even if you are not guilty of anything, it's enough you wore a German uniform. They wrote their last letter on June 2nd, 1945, announcing their departure. Dear Mom, my loved ones, perhaps I'm writing to you for the last time from this place full of suffering and anguish. Just today the commissioner told us that the matter will be cleared up in a couple of days and we will leave. 800 to 1,000 internees from Šentvid were murdered at Brezarjevo Brezno in Podutik at the start of June 1945. Slovenes were taken to Kočevski Rog in frigate trains near his village. Ivan Žužek threw a letter for his family out of the train. Those who escaped from the cave and then managed to get to the west testified there. Milan Zajec was the first to publish his memoirs in 1949. France Dejak, France Kozina, and Milan Zajec published their memoirs several times, including in the book Ušli so smrti, They Escaped Death. Anonymous testimony of Janez Janša Sr. was published in the magazine Družina in 1993. His son, Janez Janša Jr., wrote about the escape in his book Okopi, Trenches. After escaping from the cave, Janko Svete lived in Slovenia and drowned a few years later. Karel Turk also escaped from the cave, but his father turned him into the authorities and they murdered him. And I heard a voice from the side of the cave. "Friend, if you are still alive, move, otherwise another will fall on you and kill you." I was thrown into the cave at about 10 in the morning, and I was in the cave until midnight. They were killing all day long, and they killed around 800 of us that day. I saw the home guards dying. Some died instantly, but most were wounded, mortally wounded, but lived for some time. Around midnight, I got out of the cave using a tree that was probably thrown into the cave during the blasting. When I got to the top, I saw that around 20 partisans were still standing guard by the big fire. I started to move away from the cave. I stepped on a dry branch. I made some noise and they shouted, "Stop!" I stopped and waited to see what would happen. After a while, they calmed down. They thought it was nothing, and I moved away. Of course, I was scared like a rabbit during the shooting, but the second time there was such a cry. I thought to myself, "I'm alive." Outside there was silence. I saw something hanging down and I grabbed it. Then after that, bloody, completely covered in blood. What else? I made it out of the cave. There, a few hundred meters away, a fire could be seen. I thought to myself, it wouldn't be healthy for me to go there. So I went in the opposite direction. The cave was partially blasted already during the killing in 1945, but the major blasting took place about 10 years later. That is when they blew up the entire ceiling of the cave. Jože Bartol, Sr., witnessed the violent explosion from almost 40 kilometers away. I particularly remember the explosion that my father and I heard when we were working and then looking towards Kočevje, where a cloud of brown smoke could be seen. Father said, "They are blasting again in Kočevje." In the cave, archaeologists found a twisted drill and 316 unexploded pieces of ordnance, which were removed and destroyed by members of the Civil Protection Unit. In 1975, Drago Jančar was sentenced to a year in prison for bringing the book U rogu ležimo pobiti, In Rog we lied murdered, from abroad. Count Nikolai Tolstoy investigated these crimes because of the fate of Cossacks and other citizens of European Union who were returned to death and suffering from the West after the war. Nikolai Tolstoy condemned the British authorities for handing over Yugoslav prisoners of war and civilians to communist Yugoslavia. As a result, he was sentenced to unimaginably high fine of £1.5 million, which he did not pay.
Well, there are two very atrocious aspects in my mind. One is the treachery of the British decision to hand over these people. It was a completely unnecessary act. There was no real pragmatic motive and no moral justification whatever, and none has been advanced which has any credibility whatever. And on the other, of course, is the extent of the slaughter, the callousness, and the brutality.
On the Yugoslav side, France Hočevar made a deal with the British to hand over Slovene prisoners of war and civilians from Austria on May 18, 1945. That this normal human act ended as tragically as it did, that illegal violence was used against them at the time when the courts, civil, military, were operating normally, especially in Slovenia, cannot be justified historically and humanely.
Tega se zgodovinsko in človeško ne more popraviti.
The victims who were killed by the partisan movement during the war and by the communist authorities after it were deprived from their right to a grave and memory in Titoism. On July 8, 1990, they were symbolically buried with a memorial mass in the cave under Kren in Kočevski Rog. Today we know that the cave under Kren was not a place of death for Slovenes. In 2004, at the initiative of criminalist Pavle Jamnik, Mitja Ferenc, and students investigated the sinkholes in front of the caves under Kren and under Macesnova Gorica. The objects found under Kren testify mainly to Serbs, Montenegrins and Croats. The objects at Macesnova Gorica were primarily Catholic, many Slovene. Research in the sinkhole continued in 2017 with a detector survey of the area determined where the victims were led to their deaths.
Tukaj se približujemo predelu, kjer smo odkrili večjo koncentracijo predmetov.
We're now approaching the area where we discovered a greater concentration of objects, so we assume that in this clearing here, where it slowly climbs towards the cave, some groups of prisoners were being held. For example, we discovered quite a few military buttons, then a broken ring with initials, broken ends of the wires with which they were tied, and similar items. In 2019, around 1,000 cubic meters of blasted rock were excavated from the cave and a layer of human remains was found. The archaeological team of the company Augusta, led by archaeologist Luka Rozman, excavated the remains of the cave under Macesnova Gorica from May to September 2022. It was one of the most demanding archaeological undertakings in extreme conditions. The discoveries in the cave confirmed the truth of the testimonies of those who escaped from it. The work was carried out under extraordinary conditions due to the dangers in the cave, the huge amount of rocks, and unexploded explosives. They excavated 15 meters deep to the bottom of the cave. The area of the excavation increased from 200 to 500 square meters. Another 2,000 cubic meters of blasted rock were removed from the cave. How much effort was put into covering up something that should never have happened? We started the research in this cave on May 12. Above all, the biggest challenge was how we were going to carry out the project logistically. We decided to place a larger excavator on top, on which we would mount a winch. That's what we did. We brought a smaller excavator into the cave to help us with the mechanical excavation. Of course, we also used the techniques from archaeology, manual excavation and cleaning. This was very important so that after removing all the rocks, we could get to the human remains, which were then manually cleaned and then prepared for documentation to get at least an approximation of what it looked like.
Vsaj dobili en približek temu, kako je to včasih izgledalo.
The cave turned out to be more and more extensive during the work. We started with an area of 120 square meters. As we progressed deeper, we were faced with an ever-increasing surface, and therefore it was also necessary to coordinate how the course of work would take place. We decided to document the human remains in a sector-by-sector, area-by-area manner. That's why we used so-called photo sketches. Only in this way we were able to basically document the entire cave of the entire scope of this crime. And of course, logistically, it couldn't be done any other way. In addition to manual excavation and cleaning, we also used a lot of detectors. With this, we were able to find all the metal objects that people had with them.
Predmete, ki so jih imeli ljudje ob sebi.
Those who escaped from the abyss testified how the wounded took refuge in the side tunnels and crevices in the cave wall. There were at least 36 of them. The largest group of 23 died in crevice. And so around 18 of us wounded home guards got together over 5 days. While some were dying quickly one by one, about 5 of us remained strong enough to move around the cave for 4 days. If the archives have been destroyed, if the preparators remain silent or lie, archaeology and anthropology are the sciences that enable the murdered to tell what they were like, how they died. Due to fragmentation of the bones, a completely accurate account of the victims was not possible. There were at least 3,450 and probably no more than 3,500. About half, more than 1,750, were over 24, over 800 between 20 and 23, and over 800 under 20 years old. None of them were younger than 14. They were all men. We do not yet have the names of all the murdered. From the census of the Institute for the Recent History, around 1,500 people murdered in Kočevski Rog are known by name. Gunshot wounds. Basically, the fragments are only partially preserved because the bone breaks and only half is visible. Entry gunshot wounds from the outside and exit from the inside. This is the same case. And one more example. Basically, in all cases, it is gunshot wounds to the back of the head, to the skull. And here is on the hip, entrance and exit wounds on the side. So the shot went through the abdominal cavity and then the bullet came out the side. In order to be able to identify the victims after the Republic of Slovenia adopts the relevant regulations, and when such research becomes possible, the right femurs of the victims are stored in the depot of the National Forensic Laboratory of the Slovene Police in Škofja Loka. More than 10,000 objects were found during the excavation of the remains. Most of the items belonged to the victims and more than 1,600 to the perpetrators. The found objects show what the murdered had the hardest time saying goodbye to. These were signs of fate, rosaries, shrines, objects of emotional attachment, especially rings, watches. Cutlery, razors, combs, and other personal care items indicate that the victims were hoping to the last that their lives were not over. The killers left shell casing, a drill, a shovel, a pickaxe, unexploded munitions, detonated ordnance. For most of the victims, their families did not even know the presumed place of death of the murdered relatives. But they didn't forget them. Look, I've been visiting this place for years, ever since it was open to the public. Even though my mother, when she was still alive, visited, even when the police still patrolled the area. And then she told me that my uncles were here, 2 of them. And one of them was still in Gotenica, which we found out after the fact, but he disappeared sometimes in 1956, according to the death certificate. So I come here almost always, every year, not only on the 1st of November, but also many times in between. Because I live nearby, I visit and move on. I often come on foot because this tragedy that happened here must not be forgotten. As soon as a person is killed after the war, that is a crime for me, and it cannot be justified. There is no word to apologize for this. There is no reconciliation. I know there should be reconciliation, but there is no excuse for these actions without a trial. Painter Marjetka Doliner painted a triptych: The Last Walk, Silence, and Glory, in which she depicted the suffering and resurrection of those murdered in the cave under Macesnova Gorica. The Republic of Slovenia recognizes all victims of the Second World War, occupation, rebellion, revolution, counter-revolution and civil war, the right to a grave and memorial. But the rights of the dead depend on the ability of the living to do what the dead ask us to do. Murdered from the trench of St. Barbara in Huda Jama waited for us for more than 7 years so that we could bury them. Even the remains from the cave under Macesnova Gorica are waiting for us to find their peace and quiet.